It's actually me.
I'm Lewis Hamilton.
I mean, I know what I am.
I'm a professional.
Let me ask you something honestly. When you think of Lewis Hamilton, what's the first image that comes to mind?
Maybe it's because I'm black.
Because for most people, it's probably the wins, 105 of them, more than any human being has ever taken in this sport. Maybe it's that raised fist on the podium in 2020, the black helmet, the Black Lives Matter shirt under the race suit that nobody at the team knew he was wearing. Maybe it's Abu Dhabi 2021, and the silence on the team radio that followed, and the 2 months he then spent completely offline, not posting, not speaking, not appearing, while the world debated what had happened to him. But here's what I want to talk about today. Because behind all of those moments, behind the 7 world championships and the 105 wins and the knighthood and the Ferrari dream and the red carpet and the activism and the fashion weeks, there is a life. A genuinely extraordinary life that most people have never properly sat down and looked at from the beginning. We're talking about a man born in a working-class town 30 miles north of London to a father who worked 4 jobs simultaneously and remortgaged his own home multiple times so that his son could continue racing a go-kart. A man who walked up to the boss of the most famous team in Formula One at a karting awards ceremony when he was 10 years old, looked him in the eye and told him he wanted to race for McLaren one day. A man who became the first and, to this day, only black driver in the entire history of Formula One.
Every black kid experienced racism. It's just a fact.
A man who was leading a race at Abu Dhabi in 2021 with 10 laps to go and one hand on an 8th world championship, a record that would have stood completely alone in the history of sport, and had it taken from him on the final lap in circumstances the governing body later acknowledged were in breach of their own regulations, and who went silent for 56 days afterward, and who then came back. Here is the question that should make you genuinely curious, not just about Lewis Hamilton the driver, but about Lewis Hamilton the person. How does a kid from Stevenage, England, who faced racist abuse from the time he was in primary school, who watched his father sacrifice everything and was told by the sports establishment in 100 quiet ways that he didn't quite belong there, how does that kid become the most decorated racing driver the sport has ever produced? A man who used his platform to challenge an industry that had never been challenged that way before, who walked away from the safest and most successful team in the history of the sport at 40 years old to chase one more dream in a red car. Because by the end of this, you won't just know what Lewis has won, you'll understand exactly what it cost him to win it, and why the cost never once made him stop. So let's start where the story looks most complete, and work our way back to where it actually began. Chapter 1. The Life. What $450 million looks like when it came from nothing. As of 2026, Lewis Hamilton's net worth sits in the vicinity of $450 million, making him not just the wealthiest active Formula One driver, but one of the most financially successful athletes anywhere on the planet. His $60 million annual salary from Ferrari makes him the highest-paid driver in the team's history, surpassing legends like Michael Schumacher, Fernando Alonso, and Sebastian Vettel. But here's the thing that makes all of those numbers genuinely interesting. Lewis Hamilton did not arrive in this world anywhere near them. He was born in Stevenage, Hertfordshire, a town about 30 miles north of London. His father, Anthony, was of Grenadian descent, his mother, Carmen, white British from Birmingham. They separated when Lewis was 2 years old, and he was raised primarily by his mother and his half-sisters. The family did not have money to spare, not even close. When Lewis eventually started racing, his father worked every hour available to him to keep the karts on the track. There were times when Anthony worked 4 jobs simultaneously. Lewis once revealed that his dad remortgaged their home multiple times just to cover race fees and travel. In Lewis's own words, and this is the line that hits hardest every time I read it, he never had new clothes. He wasn't saving up to buy anything new. Everything, remortgaging the house multiple times, went into go-karting, which sounds crazy. It is crazy, but he believed so much in me. That is where the $450 million starts. Not with a contract, not with a talent program, with a father who bet his own house on his son. Today, Lewis owns a New York City penthouse valued at $40 million, a home in London worth around $25 million, and properties across Monaco and Switzerland. His car collection includes a 1995 McLaren F1 worth around $20 million, a Ferrari LaFerrari Aperta, and a custom-built Pagani Zonda 760 LH, a one-of-a-kind purple hypercar made specifically for him, valued at around $2 million. Every car in that collection tells you something about a man who grew up unable to afford new clothes for his father. But the life Lewis Hamilton has built goes well beyond the personal. He co-founded Neat Burger in 2019, the world's first international vegan fast food chain, owns a stake in the Denver Broncos NFL team, founded the Extreme E racing team X44, and launched his own production company, Dawn Apollo Films. He served as co-producer on the F1 movie starring Brad Pitt and Apple Studios. He was the co-chair of the 2025 Met Gala, an annual fundraising event for the Costume Institute at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. He launched his own streetwear brand, Plus 44. He has partnered with Tommy Hilfiger and Dior. He became a vegan in 2017. He speaks openly about therapy, meditation, ADHD, and dyslexia. He is, by any measure, the most culturally expansive sportsperson Formula One has ever produced.
But the one piece of what Lewis has built that I think matters more than all of it combined, and this is the most underrated thing about him as a person, is something he named after his racing number. He pledged £20 million to Mission 44, a foundation empowering underrepresented youth, and launched the Hamilton Commission to tackle motorsport's diversity gap. Named after the number he has raced under his entire career, the number his father chose because the family car had F44 on its number plate when Lewis first started racing. He took the number that connected him to his father, to the man who remortgaged the house, who worked 4 jobs, who never bought new clothes, and made it the name of a foundation designed to open the doors of this sport to every young person who looks like him and has been told in 100 quiet ways that those doors aren't for them. And that tells you more about who Lewis Hamilton actually is than any statistic, any trophy, any red carpet appearance ever could.
Changed the lives of young kids, particularly coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, opened their eyes up to the world of...
Chapter 2. The Family. The bet Anthony made and why Lewis has never stopped paying it back. Here is the thing about the Hamilton family story that I don't think gets talked about enough. And I want you to hold this thought all the way through this chapter because it connects to everything that comes after it. Most people who know Formula One know that Anthony Hamilton was Lewis's father and manager. They know he sacrificed a lot, but I don't think the scale of what Anthony actually did and what it actually built in Lewis is fully understood. Because what Anthony Hamilton built in his son through those years of frozen karting mornings and 4-job weeks and remortgaged houses was something deeply specific. He built a man who understood in his bones from an age when most of us are just learning how to be children that someone had paid everything for him to be here. And that debt was not financial. It was a responsibility to not waste what had been sacrificed. That is the fuel Lewis Hamilton has been running on for 30 years. Not ego, not validation, not records, responsibility. Lewis Hamilton was born on the 7th of January, 1985 in Stevenage, Hertfordshire. His parents separated when he was 2. He lived with his mother and half-sisters until he was 12, then moved in with his father, stepmother Linda, and half-brother Nicholas. Nicholas Hamilton was born in 1992 with cerebral palsy and later became a professional racing driver in the British Touring Car Championship. Watching his younger brother fight for a racing career against circumstances most people would have considered insurmountable shaped Lewis in ways he has spoken about openly. The understanding that determination is not about what conditions you're given, but about what you choose to do with the ones you have. His father, Anthony, had been an IT manager before Lewis's karting career consumed everything. He cleaned offices, worked as a contractor, and washed dishes, anything to keep his boy racing. He drove Lewis to races across the country. He served as manager, mechanic, strategist, and father simultaneously. He was the only person from their background trying to break into what was, at that time, an unambiguously wealthy and predominantly white sport. And he never became bitter. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Anthony Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton has spoken about this specifically, the fact that his father's response to a world that did not make things easy was never resentment. It was persistence. It was the quiet, relentless act of showing up again the following weekend. Now, the moment that changed everything. The moment that Lewis Hamilton was always going to tell you about if you asked him where his career truly began. At the age of 10, Hamilton met Ron Dennis at a karting awards ceremony and requested his autograph. He expressed his desire to drive for McLaren, and Dennis told him to call in 9 years. 10 years old, a child from Stevenage who had been racing for less than 2 years, standing in front of the most powerful man in Formula One and telling him, not asking him, telling him that one day he would race for his team. Anthony Hamilton, reflecting on that moment, said, "One of the biggest experiences was meeting Ron Dennis at the Autosport Awards when Lewis was just about 10 years of age. Lewis went up to Ron and said, 'One day I want to race for McLaren.' Ron said, 'Here's my number. Come back in 9 years' time.' I just had an ordinary job. We had no idea where the karting would lead us. It was an opportunity. They took it." In 1998, when Hamilton was 13, Dennis made good on the invitation. He signed Hamilton to the McLaren Mercedes Young Driver program, making him the youngest driver ever contracted by a Formula One team. Anthony Hamilton was told he no longer needed to fund the karting career alone. Just think about what that moment meant. The man who had remortgaged his house, who had never bought new clothes, who had worked 4 jobs, who had driven every weekend to every track in the country. He was told at that moment that the bet he had made on his son had been seen by the right people, and that from here, they would carry some of the weight.
Lewis Hamilton has never forgotten that. Everything. The activism, the Mission 44, the Hamilton Commission, the determination to open the doors of motorsport to the people who look like him, it all traces back to that moment. Because he knows, better than anyone alive, what it costs to get to that room. And he has spent his entire career trying to make sure the price is lower for whoever comes next.
Maybe it's because I'm black. That's what LAG says. I don't know.
Chapter 3. The Obsession. The driver who rewrote what it means to be an F1 champion, on the track and off it. There is a moment that happened on a Formula One starting grid in Austria in July 2020 that I want you to think about. Because it is, I think, the single most revealing thing Lewis Hamilton has ever done. The world was in the grip of the COVID pandemic. Formula One had just returned after a 3-month shutdown. The murder of George Floyd had happened 6 weeks earlier, and Lewis Hamilton, the only black driver on the grid, the only black driver in the entire history of this sport, walked out onto the grid before the race wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt that he had hidden under his race suit and took a knee on the starting straight while several of his fellow drivers stood. He revealed later that he had not told his team he was going to do it. He feared they would stop him. He said, "I remember I had my Black Lives Matter shirt hidden and I just wore it out there and went ahead with it. The sport had made all these t-shirts with the 'We Race as One' slogan, and they gave these t-shirts to everybody, and I was like, I'm not wearing that. That's not what this is about." Afterwards, my team said, "Well, if you had just told us, we could have prepared better, but I had this fear that they would try and stop me." He risked everything in that moment. Sponsorships, contracts, reputation, the carefully managed public image that a driver of his profile spends decades building. He said explicitly that he didn't care if partners dropped him, that if he didn't do it, nobody else would. He described the moment, "I remember kind of being on my knees thinking, what is happening in the world? I've got to be outspoken. I've got to take that chance. Because if I don't do it, then no one's going to do it." Now, the obsession. Because when people talk about Lewis Hamilton's obsession, they usually mean the racing. And yes, the statistics are genuinely staggering. He holds the records for most wins at 105, most pole positions at 104, and most podium finishes at 203. He is the only driver in Formula One history to have won 7 world championships and then kept going, still fighting, still showing up, still setting the fastest lap of the race at an age when most drivers are already somewhere else. But I think the deeper obsession, the one that actually defines Lewis Hamilton as a person, is the one that cannot be measured in lap times or points or trophy cabinets. Through the Hamilton Commission, a research initiative in partnership with the Royal Academy of Engineering, Lewis worked to identify ways motorsport could create opportunities for young black students and improve diversity in Formula One. His direct action, calling out the industry for its silence, led to many other drivers issuing their own anti-racism messages, and prodded F1 into launching a diversity task force and a foundation for underrepresented groups. He did all of this while simultaneously winning world championships, while managing the most scrutinized career in Formula One history, while being the only person in the paddock who looked like him, in a sport that had never before had to genuinely reckon with what that meant. And here's the detail about Lewis Hamilton's psychological architecture that the obsession reveals. Because this is the thing Jos Verstappen and Anthony Hamilton had exactly in common, despite arriving at it from completely opposite directions. Both men built sons who do not quit. Jos built Max's internal engine by withholding. Anthony built Lewis's internal engine by sacrificing. One son learned that no approval was coming, so he stopped needing it. The other son learned that approval had cost someone everything, so he could never afford to waste it. Different software, identical result. When Lewis Hamilton gets on a simulator in the middle of the night, and he does, the training schedule and simulator work he threw himself into ahead of the 2026 season was documented extensively. He is not doing it because he needs to prove something to a critic or a rival or a doubter. He is doing it because somewhere in the back of his mind, there is still a father who remortgaged his house, and the only response that has ever felt proportionate is to keep going.
So I remember I had my Black Lives Matter shirt hidden. I just wore it out there and I went ahead with it. Afterwards, my team were like, well, why don't you, if you just told us, we could have prepared better. But I had this fear that they would try and stop me, perhaps.
Chapter 4, The War and the Wait. 2021. What it feels like to win and still lose. To understand what 2021 actually was for Lewis Hamilton, you have to understand what it was asking of him specifically. He was 36 years old. He was going for an 8th World Championship, a number that had never been reached by any human being in the history of Formula One. And standing between him and that championship was Max Verstappen, 23 years old, in his first genuine championship fight, and driving a Red Bull that was, for the first time in years, genuinely capable of beating Mercedes on raw pace. The season was the most violent sporting rivalry of the modern era. Every race felt like a statement. Across 22 races, Hamilton and Verstappen won 18 of them between them combined. They went into the final round in Abu Dhabi level on points, the first time since 1974 and only the second time in the sport's history that two title contenders had arrived at the season finale tied on points. For 57 of the 58 laps, Lewis Hamilton drove one of the most controlled, dominant, composed races of his entire career. He had a comfortable lead. He was on course. The record was within reach, the kind of achievement that does not come back once it passes. And then Nicholas Latifi crashed. The safety car came out, and in the final minutes of the race, a sequence of decisions was made by the race director that allowed Max Verstappen to pit for fresh tires and line up directly behind Hamilton for a one-lap shootout on the final lap of the entire season. Hamilton has said openly, "Was I robbed? Obviously. I mean, you know the story." The FIA eventually acknowledged that the race director had misapplied the regulations. The race director was removed from his position. The result was not changed. Lewis Hamilton did not speak to the media after the race, beyond the single short interview required of him in the immediate aftermath. He did not post on social media. In his first update on social media in 56 days, Hamilton posted simply, "I've been gone. Now I'm back." 56 days of silence. Think about what that silence contains. A man who had given everything to his sport for 15 years, who had been the only black driver on the grid for his entire career, who had carried that weight, the weight of representation,
of being watched and judged not just as a driver, but as a symbol of something much larger on every lap of every race he had ever driven. Who had fought for an 8th title that would have been the greatest individual achievement in the history of his sport, and who crossed the line in 2nd place in silence after a final lap that the governing body would later acknowledge should not have happened the way it did. At Mercedes' 2022 car launch, Hamilton said that at the end of that season, he had considered whether he was willing to commit the time and effort it takes to be a world champion. "I think a lot of people underestimate what it takes," he said. "There are so many moving parts." He had lost a little bit of faith. He said so. And then he came back anyway. That is the character test. Not the wins, not the poles, not the records. The moment when everything you worked for was taken away by a decision that shouldn't have been made, and you found a reason to get back in the car.
Mark is allowed to overtake the safety car.
Michael, this isn't right.
In that moment, my world collapsed. But something told me I had to get up. You know, it's not how you fall, it's how you get up. It's always how you get up.
Chapter 5. The Refusal. Ferrari and the hardest season of his life, followed by the most defiant response. In February 2024, Lewis Hamilton announced that he was leaving Mercedes, the team he had been with for 12 years, the team with which he had won 6 of his 7 world championships, the team that was, by any objective measure, the most successful partnership in the history of Formula One. He was leaving to join Ferrari. The paddock was stunned. Ferrari's stock price jumped more than 10% on the news, and the question on everyone's lips was why. Why would a 40-year-old driver, holding every record the sport had, walk away from the safest situation in Formula One to drive for a team that hadn't won a driver's championship since 2007? Hamilton's answer was simple. He called it a childhood dream. He grew up watching Ayrton Senna. His hero drove in red, and at the end of a career that had broken every record available to it, Lewis Hamilton was not interested in finishing in silver. He wanted to know what it felt like to drive for Ferrari, to chase an 8th title in the most iconic car in the history of the sport. The hopes in 2025 were enormous, but Ferrari dropped to 4th in the standings, failed to claim a single Grand Prix victory across the entire season, and Hamilton was unable to record a podium finish for the first time in his illustrious F1 career. At 41, Lewis Hamilton experienced a podiumless year in 2025, an unprecedented statistical anomaly across his entire career, accompanied by his lowest points total in 15 years. He called himself useless in one post-qualifying interview.
Every time. Yeah, I'm useless. Absolutely useless.
He suggested Ferrari should switch drivers after qualifying behind Charles Leclerc in Hungary. He called the season a nightmare, both on a sporting and personal level.
Part of it was the car. Ferrari discovered early in the season that their car needed to be run so close to the ground to extract its best performance that it risked being declared illegal after every race. Rather than trying to close the gap to McLaren, the team decided to abandon the 2025 project altogether and focus on 2026, effectively locking in the car's flaws for the rest of the year at a time when Hamilton was still trying to understand his new team. Part of it was deeper than the car, because Lewis Hamilton is a man who wears his emotions openly, who has never hidden the cost of what he does, and in 2025, the cost was visible to everyone watching. He had left the safest team in the sport. He had chased the dream, and the dream, in its first chapter, had not gone the way he imagined. But here is the part that matters. In February 2026, ahead of his 2nd Ferrari season, Hamilton said, "I lost sight of who I was, but I'm back." He described spending the winter training from Christmas Day onwards, investing deeply in simulator sessions to influence the design of the 2026 Ferrari. "I believe in myself. I've put more work in than anyone around me," he said. In an Instagram post following preseason testing, he made his position clear. "I'm not going anywhere." A man who was told that Abu Dhabi 2021, by the most controversial final lap in the sport's modern history, that the record would not be his, came back. A man who then spent a nightmare year at Ferrari with no podiums for the first time in his career, who called himself useless on public radio, who had every reason to walk away to a very comfortable and very wealthy retirement, came back. He became heavily involved in the design of the 2026 Ferrari, spending his winter doing numerous simulator sessions in order to influence the development of the first Ferrari to meet the new regulations, determined, in his own words, not to leave Formula One on such a lackluster season.
That is the refusal. Not the wins, not the championships. The fact that after everything, the 56 days of silence after Abu Dhabi 2021, the nightmare of Ferrari 2025, the critics calling for retirement, the records that could have been enough years ago, Lewis Hamilton looked at all of it and said, not yet.
To be able to do this, to still be able to do this, is such a privilege for me to be able to continue to do.
Chapter 6. The Closing. The Grateful Part. At the beginning of this, I asked you what image comes to mind when you think of Lewis Hamilton. By now, I hope that image is a little more complicated than it was, a little more complete. The $450 million net worth exists because a man who worked 4 jobs once remortgaged a house. The 7 championships exist because a 10-year-old boy walked up to the most powerful man in Formula One and said, "I want to race for you." The activism exists because the only black driver in the history of this sport got on his knees on a starting grid in Austria in 2020 and decided that if he didn't do it, nobody would. The Ferrari move exists because a man at 40 years old refused to let comfort be a substitute for meaning. And the 2026 season exists because Lewis Hamilton looked at the hardest year of his career, looked at a 56-day silence that preceded it, looked at every single person who suggested it was time to retire, and went into his simulator instead. Here is the thesis of this whole story, and I want you to sit with it. Max Verstappen was built by a father who withheld everything, so Max learned to need nothing from anyone. Lewis Hamilton was built by a father who gave everything, so Lewis learned he could never stop giving back. 2 of the greatest drivers this sport has ever seen. 2 completely opposite origin stories. 2 internal engines built from completely different materials, running on the same fundamental fuel, which is the absolute refusal to be ordinary.
We are watching someone who was told by the world in 100 different ways across 4 decades that the space he wanted to occupy was not quite meant for him. On the starting grid, in the media, in the paddock, in Abu Dhabi, on the final lap, and who responded every single time, not with bitterness, not with retreat, but with another race, another lap, another fight, another foundation, another generation of young people he was trying to pull through a door he'd had to push open by himself. That is who Lewis Hamilton is. That is the man behind the helmet, behind the champagne, behind the knighthood and the fashion week and the Ferrari red. A boy from Stevenage whose father bet the house, who never forgot it, who never stopped paying it back. And honestly, we are just grateful we got to watch.
I love what I do with more than anything. I love this team.